The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Galactic Council's Supreme Tribunal. Commander Sarah Chun sat in the defendant's chair, her weathered hands folded in her lap, watching as alien dignitaries filed into the vast chamber. 3 years had passed since the incident on Kepler, 442b, but the memory still burned in her mind like a fresh wound. The tribunal hall was a monument to galactic cooperation, its walls adorned with the banners of 47 different species. Crystalline beings from Vega Prime floated in suspension chambers, their bodies refracting the light into prismatic rainbows. The insectoid Zephyrians clicked their mandibles in whispered conversations, while the towering Gorlaxians shifted their massive frames in specially reinforced seating. At the center of it all sat the three-judge panel: High Magistrate Veltar of the Andromedans, Judge Crickshaw of the Hegemony, and Judge Theron of the Republic Worlds. Sarah had seen enough courtrooms during her 30-year military career to know when the deck was stacked against her. The prosecution's table groaned under the weight of evidence files, holographic displays, and testimony recordings. Her own defense consisted of a single public defender, Lieutenant Commander Torres, who looked barely old enough to have graduated from the academy. "The defendant will rise," announced High Magistrate Veltar, his voice carrying through the chamber's translation systems in dozens of languages simultaneously. Sarah stood, her dress uniform pristine despite the circumstances. The medals on her chest caught the light: Purple Heart, Silver Star, the Distinguished Service Cross, and 20 others earned through blood and sacrifice. Prosecutor General Zixthara, a tall, gaunt being with silver skin and no visible eyes, glided to the center of the chamber. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Honored judges, we are here today to address one of the most heinous war crimes committed in recent galactic history. The defendant, Commander Sarah Chun of the Terran Space Forces, stands accused of the willful destruction of a civilian settlement, resulting in the deaths of 847 Exarian civilians, including 312 children." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She had learned long ago that in situations like this, patience was often the only weapon at her disposal. The prosecutor continued, "The evidence will show that on stardate 2387.156, Commander Chun deliberately ordered an orbital bombardment of an Exarian colony of New Haven on Kepler, 442b, despite knowing full well that it contained non-combatants. Her actions violated not only the Geneva Conventions of Earth, but also the Galactic Accords on the Protection of Civilian Populations." Holographic displays materialized above the chamber, showing the verdant world of Kepler, 442b, before the bombardment. New Haven had been a model colony, gleaming spires rising from carefully cultivated farmland, children playing in crystal-clear streams, families living in harmony with the planet's unique ecosystem. Then, the images shifted to the aftermath: smoking craters, twisted metal, and bodies scattered like broken dolls. The prosecution will demonstrate that this was not a tactical decision made in the heat of battle. Zixthara's voice grew colder, but rather a calculated act of genocide perpetrated by a species known for its aggressive tendencies. Humanity's history is written in blood, from their ancient world wars to their recent expansion into our galaxy. Commander Chin's actions on Kepler, 442b, represent everything that is dangerous about allowing humans into our peaceful galactic community. Sarah felt the weight of every alien gaze upon her. She had expected this narrative. Since humanity's first contact with the Galactic Council 15 years ago, there had been those who viewed her species with suspicion and fear. Humans were newcomers, primitives who had barely mastered interstellar travel, while other species had been exploring the galaxy for millennia. The fact that humans had also brought with them a reputation for violence and warfare only added fuel to the fire. "The evidence against the defendant is overwhelming," the prosecutor continued. "We have flight recorder data from her ship, communications logs, and testimony from surviving members of her own crew. All of this clearly shows that Commander Chun had multiple opportunities to avoid civilian casualties, but chose instead to prioritize military objectives over innocent lives. Judge Crickshaw leaned forward, her insectoid features difficult to read. Prosecutor General, while the charges are indeed serious, this tribunal has always maintained that context matters in cases of this magnitude. What were the circumstances that led to this bombardment? Zixtara's expression, if it could be called that, seemed to darken. The defendant claims she was responding to a distress signal from the colony, but our investigation has revealed no evidence of any legitimate threat to civilian populations. The Nexarian forces present on Kepler 442b were conducting peaceful mining operations when the defendant arrived with a full battle group and opened fire without provocation. That's a lie, Sarah said quietly, the words escaping before she could stop them. High Magistrate Veltar struck his gavel. The defendant will remain silent unless called upon to speak. Torres, Sarah's defender, rose nervously. Your Honors, if I may, the defense would like to request that we hear the complete mission logs before making any determinations about my client's motivations. Denied, Judge Theron replied curtly. The prosecution has the right to present its case first. You will have your opportunity to respond in due time. As Zixtara continued her opening statement, Sarah's mind drifted back to that day 3 years ago. The distress signal had come in the middle of the night, ship's time. She had been in her quarters, reading a letter from her daughter back on Earth, when Lieutenant Zhang burst through her door. Commander, we're receiving an emergency transmission from Kepler 442b, he had said, his face pale. It's coming from the Nexarian colony, but the signal is weak and breaking up. Sarah had rushed to the bridge, where her communications officer, Ensign Park, was struggling to clean up the transmission. What they heard still haunted her dreams. Please, anyone, they came from the mountains, taking the children. Please help us. The voice was young, terrified, speaking in accented standard. In the background, they could hear screaming, weapons fire, and something else, a sound like nothing Sarah had ever encountered, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the ship's hull, even through the recording. How far are we from Kepler 442b? Sarah had asked her navigator. 14 hours at maximum warp, Commander. Set course immediately. And send a message to command. Tell them we're responding to a civilian distress call. The journey to Kepler 442b had been tense. Long-range sensors showed unusual energy signatures throughout the system, but the distance made detailed scans impossible. Sarah had ordered her crew to prepare for anything: humanitarian relief, evacuation operations, or combat if necessary. When they finally arrived, what they found defied all expectations. The Nexarian colony was indeed under attack, but not by any conventional military force. The aggressors were unlike anything in the galactic databases, creatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time, their forms shifting and changing like living shadows. They called themselves the Devourers, and they had come to Kepler 442b for one purpose: to harvest the neural energy of sentient beings. Sarah had watched in horror through her ship's view screen as these creatures systematically rounded up colonists, connecting them to grotesque biomechanical devices that slowly drained their life force. The process was agonizing, designed not just to extract energy, but to maximize suffering as terror and pain somehow made the harvest more potent. Commander, her tactical officer had reported, I'm reading massive underground installations throughout the colony. These things have been here for weeks, maybe months. They've converted the entire settlement into some kind of processing facility. The few surviving colonists had been herded into the central plaza, where the largest of the harvesting machines waited. Sarah could see families huddled together, children crying, parents desperately trying to shield their young ones from the horrors around them. Among them, she had spotted the small figure that would later change everything: a little Nexarian girl, no more than 7 years old in human equivalent, standing alone near one of the machines. Options, Sarah had asked her senior staff. Limited, ma'am. Her executive officer, Commander Wright had replied. These devourers seem to exist partially in subspace. Our conventional weapons are having minimal effect. We've managed to damage a few of their smaller constructs, but the main installations are heavily shielded. What about a surgical strike on the plaza? Can we extract the survivors? Negative. The devourers have some kind of interdiction field active. Our transporters can't get a lock, and any shuttle we send down would be destroyed before reaching the surface. Sarah had stared at the tactical display, her mind racing through possibilities. Every passing moment meant more innocent lives lost to the horrors below. She thought of her own daughter, safe at home on Earth, and imagined her trapped in such a nightmare. There is one option, her science officer, Lieutenant Commander Patel, had said hesitantly. The Devourer's installations appear to be drawing power from the planet's core through a network of quantum conduits. If we could disrupt that network, what would that require? A focused antimatter bombardment, targeted at specific geological weak points. The resulting seismic activity would destabilize their power grid and likely destroy most of their infrastructure. Wright had looked up from his console, his face grim. Commander, that kind of bombardment would level the entire colony. Anyone still on the surface would be killed in the process, Sarah finished. How long until the harvest is complete? Based on their current rate of processing, Patel had calculated quickly, maybe 6 hours. After that, there won't be anyone left to save. The weight of command had never felt heavier. Sarah looked again at the view screen, where the little Nexarian girl stood frozen in terror as one of the Devourers approached her. In that moment, she saw every child she had ever sworn to protect, every innocent life that depended on her making the right choice. The girl couldn't have been much older than Sarah's own daughter had been when she first left for military service. She had promised herself then that she would do whatever it took to make the galaxy a safer place for children like hers. Now, faced with an impossible choice, she had to decide whether to honor that promise. Commander, Wright prompted softly. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with grim determination. Begin targeting sequence. We're going to save as many as we can. The bombardment had lasted 18 minutes. Precise antimatter strikes hit 12 different locations simultaneously, triggering a cascade of geological instability that tore the Devourer installations apart from below. The quantum conduits collapsed, cutting off their power supply and causing their harvesting machines to shut down. But the cost had been terrible. The seismic shocks had leveled most of the colony, burying both the Devourers and hundreds of colonists under tons of debris. When the dust settled and Sarah's rescue teams finally reached the surface, they found only 47 survivors, most of them children who had been small enough to hide in the colony's reinforced school building. Among them was the little girl Sarah had seen in the plaza. She had somehow survived by crawling into a maintenance tunnel when the bombardment began and emerged 3 hours later, traumatized but alive. The rescue team had found her clutching a small toy, calling out for her parents who would never answer. Back in the tribunal chamber, Prosecutor General Zixthara was presenting her evidence with clinical precision. Flight recorder data showed the bombardment from multiple angles. Communications logs revealed Sarah's orders to her crew. Medical records documented the casualties, complete with holographic recreations of the victims. The defendant had other options, the prosecutor argued. She could have withdrawn and called for reinforcements. She could have attempted to negotiate with the attacking forces. Instead, she chose the most violent solution possible, one that guaranteed massive civilian casualties. Judge Crickshaw studied the evidence displays. Prosecutor General, you mentioned attacking forces. What do we know about these aggressors? According to the defendant's reports, they were some previously unknown alien species. However, no independent verification of this claim has been possible. The defendant's own bombardment destroyed any evidence that might have supported her story. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. The prosecutor was carefully omitting crucial details: the nature of the Devourers, the harvesting process, the fact that the colonists were being systematically tortured and murdered. Without that context, Her actions appeared to be those of a trigger-happy human, following her species' violent instincts. Torres rose again. Your Honors, the defense objects to this characterization. The prosecution is presenting a deliberately incomplete picture of the events on Kepler, 442b. The defense will have its opportunity to present evidence, High Magistrate Veltar replied. Until then, you will allow the prosecution to proceed. As the morning wore on, more evidence was presented. Surveillance footage from the colony's final days, carefully edited to remove any clear images of the devourers. Testimony from Nexarian survivors, who spoke only of the bombardment, not what preceded it. Expert analysis of the bombardment patterns, which concluded that the strikes were unnecessarily destructive. Sarah watched it all with growing frustration. The prosecution was building a careful narrative that painted humanity as an aggressive, militaristic species prone to solving problems with overwhelming force. Her actions were being presented as a war crime, not as a desperate attempt to prevent genocide. But she also noticed something else. In the gallery, sitting in a section reserved for civilian witnesses, was a small group of Nexarian children. They were older now than they had been 3 years ago, but she recognized several faces from the rescue operation. Among them sat the little girl from the plaza, now 10 years old, watching the proceedings with solemn attention. Their eyes met across the chamber, and for a moment, Sarah saw something in the child's gaze that gave her hope. Not fear or hatred, but recognition and perhaps understanding. The first day of proceedings concluded with Prosecutor General Zixthara summarizing her case. Honored judges, the evidence is clear. Commander Sarah Chun committed an act of unprecedented brutality against civilian populations. Her claims of heroism are nothing more than an attempt to justify the unjustifiable. The galaxy cannot allow such actions to go unpunished, lest we encourage others to follow her example. As the tribunal adjourned for the day, Sarah was escorted back to her holding cell in the courthouse basement. Torres followed, his expression troubled. Commander, I have to ask, he said once they were alone. Is there anything about that day that you haven't told me? Anything that might help your case? Sarah looked at the young officer for a long moment. Everything I've told you is the truth, Lieutenant Commander. But the truth isn't always enough in a courtroom. What do you mean? I mean that sometimes doing the right thing looks exactly like doing the wrong thing. And sometimes the people you save are the only ones who can tell the difference. As Torres left, Sarah sat alone in her cell, thinking about the little girl in the gallery. Tomorrow, the prosecution would continue building its case, painting her as a war criminal and humanity as a threat to galactic peace. But somewhere in this vast courthouse, a child who had lived through hell itself was preparing to tell a very different story. The question was whether anyone would listen. Outside her cell window, the lights of the galactic capital twinkled like distant stars. Somewhere among them, Sarah knew, were others like her, soldiers and officers who had made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. The outcome of this trial wouldn't just determine her fate, but the fate of every human serving in the galaxy's defense forces. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her dreams were filled with the sound of a terrified child's voice calling for help across the vast darkness of space. Tomorrow, that same voice might be the key to her salvation or her final condemnation. The second day of the trial began with Prosecutor General Zixthara calling her first witness. Admiral Thekvar of the Nexarian Defense Force materialized on the witness stand, his reptilian features cast in sharp relief by the chamber's harsh lighting. His testimony was methodical, clinical, and devastating. The Nexarian government dispatched my investigation team to Kepler, 442b immediately following the bombardment, the Admiral stated, his forked tongue flicking out between words. What we found was nothing short of a massacre. Entire city blocks reduced to rubble, families buried alive in their homes, children who died, crying for parents who could not save them. Sarah watched from the defendant's table as holographic displays showed the aftermath of her bombardment from every conceivable angle. The images were designed for maximum emotional impact. A child's toy half buried in debris, a family portrait scattered across destroyed pavement, personal belongings scattered like autumn leaves across the devastation. Admiral, the prosecutor continued, in your expert opinion, were there alternatives to such destructive action? Absolutely, Thekvar replied without hesitation. Standard protocol in such situations calls for measured response, surgical strikes against military targets, and preservation of civilian infrastructure. What we see here is the opposite, a scorched earth approach that shows callous disregard for innocent life. Torres scribbled notes frantically, but Sarah could see the doubt creeping into her defender's eyes. Without context, without the full truth about the devourers, her actions appeared indefensible. The prosecution spent the morning parading witnesses before the tribunal. Nexarian colonists described the terror they felt when human warships appeared in orbit. Military experts analyzed the bombardment patterns and concluded they were designed for maximum destruction. Psychologists testified about humanity's inherently aggressive nature and their inability to consider nonviolent solutions to complex problems. Humans are a young species, testified Dr. Vexhai, a noted xenopsychologist from the Centauri Collective. Their evolutionary history is marked by constant warfare, territorial disputes, and tribal violence. When faced with any challenge, their instinctive response is to apply overwhelming force. Commander Chin's actions on Kepler 442b are not an aberration. They are entirely consistent with human behavioral patterns. Judge Theron leaned forward. Doctor, are you suggesting that humans are inherently incapable of peaceful coexistence? Not incapable, Your Honor, but certainly predisposed toward violent solutions. Their military doctrine, their cultural mythology, their historical records, all emphasize the glorification of warfare and the belief that might makes right. In my professional opinion, allowing humans to maintain military forces within galactic space represents an ongoing threat to civilian populations. Sarah felt the weight of an entire species' future pressing down on her shoulders. This trial wasn't just about her actions on Kepler 442b. It was about whether humanity would be allowed to remain part of the galactic community or would be forcibly isolated back to their home system. During the lunch recess, Torres met with Sarah in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he reviewed his notes. Commander, I have to be honest with you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This isn't going well. The prosecution has built an airtight case, and every expert they bring to the stand makes humans look like bloodthirsty savages. If we don't find a way to change the narrative, what about the survivor testimonies? Sarah asked. The children who were rescued from the colony. Torres shook his head. The prosecution has already interviewed them. Their statements focus entirely on the bombardment itself, the terror they felt, the friends and family they lost. None of them mention these devourers you described. They were traumatized, Sarah protested. Children that young, subjected to such horror. Of course their memories would be fragmented. Maybe so, but fragmented testimony isn't going to overturn hard evidence. The flight recorders, the communications logs, the casualty reports, they all tell the same story. Sarah stared out the conference room window at the bustling streets of the galactic capital. Beings from dozens of species went about their daily lives, secure in the knowledge that the galaxy's peace was protected by law and order. None of them knew how close they had come to facing the same fate as the colonists on Kepler 442b. There has to be something, she said quietly. Some evidence that survived, some record that proves what really happened. Commander, I've been through every piece of data from that mission. If such evidence exists, it's either been destroyed or classified beyond my security clearance. What about the Nexarian girl? The one I saw in the gallery yesterday. Torres consulted his tablet. Zaranethka, age 10. She was 7 at the time of the incident. The prosecution interviewed her as well, but her statement was deemed inadmissible due to her age and traumatic stress. She claims to have no memory of the events preceding the bombardment. Sarah's heart sank. The one witness who might have been able to corroborate her story had been effectively silenced by trauma and legal technicalities. The afternoon session resumed with more expert testimony. This time, the prosecution focused on the technical aspects of the bombardment, bringing in military analysts who dissected every aspect of Sarah's tactical decisions. The targeting pattern shows clear intent to maximize collateral damage, testified General Colvex of the Hegemony Defense Corps. A competent military commander would have identified specific military targets and used precision strikes to neutralize them. Instead, we see indiscriminate bombardment of civilian areas with no clear military value. Prosecutor General Zixtera activated a three-dimensional tactical display showing Kepler 442b during the bombardment. Red indicators marked the impact sites of Sarah's antimatter strikes, while blue indicators showed the locations of civilian shelters and infrastructure. As you can see, honor judges, there is significant overlap between the bombardment pattern and civilian population centers. This was not collateral damage. This was targeted destruction of non-combatant areas. Sarah wanted to scream. The prosecutor was showing the final moments of the bombardment, but not what preceded it. The display showed the impact craters, but not the underground installations they had destroyed. It showed the civilian casualties, but not the hundreds of harvesting machines that had been feeding on the colonist life force. Torres rose to object. Your Honors, the prosecution is presenting incomplete tactical data. The defense requests access to the complete mission logs, including sensor readings from the entire engagement. Judge Crickshaw consulted with her fellow judges before responding. The request is denied. The prosecution has presented sufficient evidence to support their claims. The defense will have their opportunity to present contrary evidence during their portion of the trial. But Sarah knew that opportunity was meaningless without the crucial data that would prove her innocence. The Devourer technology had been unlike anything in the galactic databases, existing partially in subspace, their energy signatures barely detectable by standard sensors. Even her own ship's advanced scanning equipment had struggled to get clear readings on their installations. The prosecution's final witness of the day was Commander Velnoth, Sarah's own executive officer who had been present during the bombardment. Sarah felt a chill as her former subordinate took the stand, avoiding her gaze. Commander Velnoth, the prosecutor began, you served under the defendant during the Kepler 442b incident. Please describe her demeanor and decision-making process during the engagement. Velnoth, a tall, blue-skinned humanoid from Rigel 7, spoke in carefully measured tones. Commander Chun was intense during the engagement. She seemed focused on military objectives to the exclusion of civilian considerations. When I raised concerns about collateral damage, she dismissed them. Did she at any point express regret or hesitation about the bombardment? No, ma'am. She ordered the strikes without hesitation and showed no remorse afterward. Sarah's jaw clenched. Velnoth's testimony was technically accurate, but it omitted the crucial context that made her actions necessary. She had been intense because innocent lives hung in the balance. She had dismissed concerns about collateral damage because the alternative was allowing hundreds more civilians to be tortured and murdered. She had shown no remorse because she had made the only choice possible under the circumstances. In your professional opinion, the prosecutor continued, were there alternative courses of action that might have achieved the same military objectives with fewer civilian casualties? Yes, ma'am. We could have called for reinforcements, attempted to establish communication with the attacking forces, or conducted more surgical strikes against specific military targets. And why weren't these alternatives pursued? Velnoth glanced at Sarah for the first time since taking the stand. Commander Chun believed that speed was essential. She felt that any delay would result in additional casualties. But you disagreed? I believe that the preservation of civilian lives should have taken priority over speed of resolution. Sarah closed her eyes. Without the full context of what the Devourers were doing to the colonists, Velnotha's position sounded reasonable, even noble. But he had been there. He had seen the sensor readings showing the harvesting machines in operation. Why wasn't he mentioning that? Torres called for a brief recess and pulled Sarah aside. "What's going on with Velnoth?" he asked urgently. "His testimony is crucifying you, but you said he was there for the whole engagement. Didn't he see these Devourers you described?" "He saw the sensor readings," Sarah replied grimly. "But Velnoth always played things by the book. He probably convinced himself that there was another explanation for what we detected. Or he's been pressured to testify in a certain way," Torres suggested. "The prosecution has been very thorough in their preparation." When the session resumed, Torres began his cross-examination of Velnoth. "Commander, during the engagement on Kepler 442b, what did your ship's sensors detect in the colony?" Velnoth hesitated. "We detected unusual energy signatures throughout the settlement." "What kind of energy signatures?" "They were difficult to classify, partially subspace-based, with quantum fluctuations that didn't match any known technology." Torres pressed forward. "Did these energy signatures suggest the presence of unknown technology or entities?" "The readings were anomalous, yes." "Did you report these anomalous readings to Galactic Command?" Another hesitation. "The mission logs were classified immediately following our return to base." "By whom?" Prosecutor General Zixterar rose to object. "Your Honors, this line of questioning ventures into classified military intelligence that is beyond the scope of this tribunal." Judge Theron sustained the objection. "The witness will not answer questions regarding classified information." Torres tried a different approach. "Commander Velnoth, when you served under the defendant, did you ever know her to deliberately target civilian populations?" "No," Velnoth admitted. "Commander Chen always prioritized the protection of non-combatants." "Did she have a reputation for excessive use of force?" "No. She was known for her restraint and tactical precision." "Then why, in your opinion, did she choose such destructive action on Kepler 442b? Velnoth looked uncomfortable. "She believed the situation required immediate action." "What situation specifically?" Another objection from the prosecution shut down that line of inquiry. Torres returned to his seat, frustrated, but having scored some small points for the defense. As the day's proceedings concluded, Sarah noticed movement in the gallery. The group of Nexarian children who had been present the day before were filing out, but the young girl, Zara, lingered behind. She was staring at Sarah with an expression that was difficult to read. Their eyes met again, and this time Sarah saw something that hadn't been there before. Recognition, yes, but also something else. The girl's lips moved silently, forming words that only Sarah could see. "I remember." The guards escorted Sarah back to her holding cell as the courthouse emptied for the evening. But that brief moment of connection with Zara filled her with the first hope she had felt since the trial began. Somewhere in that traumatized child's memories lay the truth about Kepler 442b. The question was whether anyone would believe her. That night, as Sarah lay on her narrow bunk, she thought about the testimony she had heard. Velnoth's words stung because they contained just enough truth to be damaging, while omitting the crucial context that would have vindicated her actions. He had been there, had seen the same sensor readings, had witnessed the same horrors. Yet his testimony made it sound like she had acted out of bloodlust rather than desperation. She understood the position he was in. Speaking truthfully about the Devourers would require him to contradict official reports and potentially expose classified information that could endanger galactic security. It was easier to paint her as a trigger-happy human than to admit that the galaxy faced a threat that made humanity's violent reputation seem quaint by comparison. But understanding didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. A soft knock on her cell door interrupted her thoughts. Through the small window, she could see Torres standing in the corridor, his expression troubled. "Commander," he said when the guard allowed him inside. "We need to talk." Sarah sat up on her bunk. "What is it?" "I've been doing some research into the prosecution's case, and I've found something troubling." Several of the witnesses who testified today have been given immunity deals in exchange for their cooperation. What kind of immunity? Velnath was facing charges for failure to properly document anomalous sensor readings. Admiral Thekvar was under investigation for misappropriation of reconstruction funds on Kepler 442b. Dr. Vexai had her research funding cut until she agreed to testify. Sarah felt a cold anger building in her chest. They're being coerced. It appears so. The prosecution has been very careful to ensure that their witnesses present a unified narrative. Can we use this information? Torres shook his head. Not directly. The immunity deals are legal, and the witness's testimony is still admissible. But it does suggest that there's more to this case than the prosecution wants the tribunal to know. What about the classified files? The mission reports from Kepler 442b. I've submitted formal requests through every channel I can think of. They've all been denied on grounds of galactic security. Sarah stood and paced the small confines of her cell. Someone doesn't want the truth to come out. The question is why. Maybe they're afraid of panic, Torres suggested. If these devourers you described really exist, knowledge of their capabilities could destabilize the galactic economy. Or maybe someone made a deal with them, Sarah said darkly. Maybe the powers that be decided it was easier to sacrifice a few human careers than to acknowledge that their precious peace and order isn't as secure as they pretend. Torres looked uncomfortable with that suggestion, but he didn't dismiss it entirely. What do we do now? Sarah stopped pacing and looked at her young defender. We tell the truth, the whole truth, regardless of the consequences. And we hope that somewhere in this vast tribunal chamber, there's still someone willing to listen to it. Even if it means revealing classified information. Even if it means starting a war. Outside her cell window, the lights of the galactic capital continued their eternal dance, oblivious to the drama playing out in the courthouse below. Tomorrow would bring new witnesses, new evidence, and new attempts to paint humanity as a threat to galactic peace. But it would also bring Sarah's chance to tell her side of the story. She only hoped it wouldn't be too late. The third day of the trial marked the beginning of the defense case, and the atmosphere in the tribunal chamber felt different. Where the prosecution had filled their time with calculated presentations and carefully coached witnesses, Torres seemed to be operating on instinct and desperation. Honored judges, he began, his voice stronger than it had been in previous days. The prosecution has painted a picture of Commander Chun as a reckless military officer who prioritized destruction over preservation of life. Today, I will show you that this characterization is not only false, but deliberately misleading. Sarah watched from a defendant's table as her young defender activated his own holographic displays. Instead of showing the aftermath of the bombardment, these images depicted her service record spanning 3 decades. Commander Sarah Chun has served with distinction in 17 different conflict zones, Torres continued. Her record shows consistent adherence to the laws of war, protection of civilian populations, and innovative tactical solutions that minimize casualties while achieving mission objectives. The first witness Torres called was Admiral Rebecca Hayes, Sarah's former commanding officer from the Centauri border conflicts. The elderly woman materialized via quantum link from Earth, her weathered face showing the strain of her 93 years. Admiral, Torres began, you commanded the defendant during some of the most challenging military operations in recent human history. How would you characterize her approach to civilian protection? Admiral Hayes' voice carried the authority of someone who had seen the worst of warfare and emerged with her principles intact. Sarah Chun was the most conscientious officer I ever served with. During the siege of New Angeles, she refused direct orders from Sector Command because they would have resulted in unnecessary civilian casualties. She was nearly court-martialed for insubordination, but her alternative plan saved over 10,000 lives. Did she ever show disregard for the rules of engagement? Never. In fact, she often went beyond requirements to ensure civilian safety. During the evacuation of Kepler 186c, She delayed her own ship's departure to rescue a group of colonists that other commanders had written off as lost. Prosecutor General Zixthera rose to cross-examine. Admiral Hayes, were any of these previous engagements similar to the situation on Kepler 442b? I'm not familiar with the specific circumstances of that mission. Then, how can you comment on the appropriateness of the defendant's actions? Admiral Hayes straightened in her chair, her expression hardening. I can comment on her character, prosecutor. And Sarah Chin's character is one of unwavering commitment to protecting innocent life. Yet she destroyed an entire colony, according to your version of events. But I know Sarah Chun, and if she ordered that bombardment, she had a damn good reason. The exchange continued for several minutes, with the prosecutor attempting to discredit Hayes' testimony by pointing out that she hadn't been present on Kepler 442b. But the Admiral's unwavering defense of Sarah's character clearly made an impression on the judges. Torres' next witness was Dr. Elizabeth Tanaka, a xenobiologist who had worked with Sarah on several first contact missions. Dr. Tanaka, Torres began, you've observed the defendant's behavior when encountering unknown alien species. How would you describe her approach? Commander Chin always prioritized communication over confrontation, Tanaka replied. She believed that understanding was the key to peaceful coexistence. Even when dealing with hostile species, she would exhaust diplomatic options before resorting to force. Was she ever quick to use military force? Quite the opposite. She was sometimes criticized by other officers for being too cautious, too willing to talk when others wanted to shoot. This testimony continued the theme Torres was trying to establish, that Sarah's actions on Kepler 442b were completely out of character for an officer known for her restraint and diplomatic approach. But Sarah knew that character witnesses, no matter how compelling, wouldn't be enough to overcome the hard evidence the prosecution had presented. She needed to tell her own story to explain what had really happened on that distant world. When Torres called her to the stand, the entire chamber fell silent. Sarah rose from the defendant's table and walked to the witness stand with the measured pace of someone who had faced down enemy fire on a dozen different worlds. She wore her dress uniform, every medal and ribbon precisely placed, a visual reminder of her decades of service. Commander Chun, Torres began after she had been sworn in, please tell this tribunal in your own words what happened on Kepler 442b. Sarah looked out at the assembled judges and gallery, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. In the front row of the gallery, she could see the group of Nexarian children again, including young Zara, who was watching intently. 3 years ago, Sarah began, my ship, the UES Redemption, received a distress signal from the Nexarian colony of New Haven. The transmission was fragmented, but we could clearly hear voices calling for help, reporting that something was taking the children. She described the journey to Kepler 442b, the discovery of the Devourer installations, and the horrific scene they found in the colony. As she spoke, she watched the judges' faces, trying to gauge their reactions. The creatures we encountered defied classification, she continued. They existed partially in subspace, making them nearly immune to conventional weapons. They had converted the entire colony into a harvesting facility, using biomechanical devices to slowly drain the life force from captured colonists. Judge Crickshaw interrupted. Commander, you described these alleged creatures in great detail, yet no physical evidence of their existence has been presented to this tribunal. The bombardment destroyed most of their installations, Your Honor, but our sensor logs should contain detailed readings of their technology. Those logs have been classified as a matter of galactic security, Judge Theron noted. Then, you're asking me to defend my actions without allowing me to present the evidence that would vindicate them, Sarah replied firmly. Prosecutor General Zixthera rose to object. Your Honors, the defendant is attempting to deflect responsibility by creating an elaborate fiction about unknown alien aggressors. It's not fiction, Sarah said, her voice rising. I watched these things torture innocent civilians. I saw families torn apart, children screaming as their life force was drained away. Every moment we delayed meant more deaths. Then, why? The prosecutor pressed. Don't any of the survivors corroborate your story? Sarah's jaw tightened. Because they were traumatized beyond measure. Because children that young couldn't possibly process what they witnessed. Because a small voice from the gallery interrupted her. Because you told us not to remember. The entire chamber turned toward the source of the voice. In the front row, young Zaranethka had stood up, her small frame trembling but her voice clear and strong. High Magistrate Veltar struck his gavel. The gallery will remain silent during proceedings. But Zara ignored him, stepping into the aisle as courtroom security moved to intercept her. She's not lying, the girl cried out. The shadow things were real. They took my parents. They were going to take me too. The chamber erupted in chaos as security guards approached the child. But before they could reach her, she called out again, her voice carrying over the din. That's the soldier who saved me. The words hit the chamber like a physical blow. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Security guards paused in their advance. Even the judges seemed momentarily stunned by the child's declaration. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at the brave little girl who had finally found the courage to speak the truth. Zara, no, Sarah whispered, knowing that the child's testimony would likely be dismissed as traumatic fantasy. But Zara wasn't finished. As the security guards reached her, she pulled something from her pocket, a small device that Sarah recognized immediately. I kept this, Zara said, holding up the object for everyone to see. From one of the shadow machines. It's how I remember when the grown-ups tell me to forget. The device was small, no larger than a coin, but its surface shifted and flowed with patterns that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could process. Even at this distance, Sarah could see that it was unmistakably alien technology, nothing like anything in the known galactic databases. Dr. Vexhai, the xenopsychologist who had testified for the prosecution, leaned forward in his seat, his expression suddenly very interested. Your Honors, Torres called out, I request that this evidence be examined immediately. Prosecutor General Zixtera objected vehemently. This child's testimony is inadmissible due to her age and traumatic state. Any alleged evidence should be dismissed as fabrication or delusion. But Judge Crickshaw was already signaling for court technicians. The device will be scanned and analyzed. Bailiff, please escort the child to a secure area where she can provide her testimony in a controlled environment. As Zara was gently led away by court officials, she looked back at Sarah one more time. Thank you, she mouthed silently. The recess that followed was tense and chaotic. Court technicians worked frantically to analyze the device, while Torres tried to prepare for questioning a 10-year-old witness. Sarah sat in the defendant's chair, hardly daring to hope that this unexpected development might change the outcome of the trial. When proceedings resumed an hour later, the atmosphere in the chamber was electric with anticipation. The lead court technician, a crystalline being from Alpha Centauri, presented his findings to the tribunal. Honored judges, the technician reported, the device presents characteristics that are unlike any known technology in our databases. It operates on quantum principles that we do not fully understand, and its composition includes materials that exist in a state of quantum superposition. Could such a device be fabricated? Judge Theron asked. Not with any known technology, Your Honor. The quantum engineering required would be beyond the capabilities of any current galactic civilization. The implication was clear. Either the device was genuine alien technology, or it represented a scientific breakthrough so advanced that no known species could have created it. There's more, the technician continued. The device appears to contain stored sensory data, essentially recorded memories. We've been able to extract partial sequences that show disturbing imagery. A holographic display materialized above the chamber, showing grainy, distorted images from Zara's memories. The quality was poor, filtered through the perception of a traumatized child, but the essential details were unmistakable. Shadow creatures moving through the colony. biomechanical devices attached to screaming victims, families being torn apart by beings that seem to exist partially outside normal space. And, through it all, the distinctive energy signatures that Sarah's ship had detected, the same anomalous readings that had been dismissed as sensor malfunctions in the prosecution's narrative. The gallery watched in stunned silence as the horror of Kepler 442b was revealed in all its terrible reality. The images confirmed everything Sarah had described, and more. This device, Judge Crickshaw said slowly, serves as a form of protected memory storage? It appears so, Your Honor. The quantum fields generated by the device would protect stored memories from conventional psychic interference or memory manipulation. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. The reason the other survivors couldn't remember the devourers wasn't trauma-induced amnesia. Their memories had been actively suppressed, probably by some form of psychic manipulation that the creatures had used to hide their presence. Only Zara, protected by the alien device she had found, retained clear memories of what had really happened. Torres requested an immediate recess to review this new evidence and prepare for Zara's testimony. As the judges deliberated, Sarah found herself surrounded by a swirl of activity. Torres was frantically reviewing legal precedents for child witness testimony. Court technicians continued their analysis of the memory device. And, in the gallery, she could see alien delegates from various species engaged in urgent whispered conversations. The revelation that unknown hostile aliens had been operating within galactic space, successfully concealing their presence through advanced technology, had implications that went far beyond her own trial. When Zara finally took the stand, the entire chamber held its breath. The little Nexarian girl looked impossibly small in the witness chair, but her voice was steady as she began to describe the events on Kepler 442b. They came in the night, she said, her words translated into dozens of languages simultaneously. The shadow things. They made the grown-ups stop talking, stop remembering. But I found the shiny thing, and it helped me remember. What do these shadow things do? Torres asked gently. They put the people in the machines. The machines hurt them and took their light away. The shadow things got bigger when they took the light. How long did this continue? Many days. They took my mama and papa first. Then my teacher. Then my friends. I hid in the school, but they were coming for me too. What happened when the human ships arrived? Zara looked directly at Sarah, her young face serious beyond her years. The soldier lady's ships came and made loud noises in the sky. The shadow things got angry and tried to take everyone faster. But then the ground shook and the machines broke and the shadow things went away. Were you afraid of the soldier lady? No, Zara said firmly. She saved me. She saved all of us who were left. The prosecution's cross-examination was brief and careful. Zixtara clearly recognized that attacking a child witness would be counterproductive, especially one whose testimony was corroborated by alien technology that experts couldn't explain. Zara, the prosecutor said gently, these events you describe were very frightening. Isn't it possible that your memories are confused, that you're mixing up dreams with reality? Zara shook her head. The shiny thing doesn't lie. It shows what really happened. How do you know this device shows true memories? Because it shows the scary parts and the good parts. Dreams only show one or the other. It was a remarkably sophisticated answer from a 10-year-old, and it clearly impressed the judges. When Zara's testimony concluded, the chamber buzzed with subdued conversation. The little girl had provided a first-hand account that completely contradicted the prosecution's narrative. More importantly, she had provided physical evidence that supported Sarah's claims about the devourers. But Sarah knew that the battle was far from over. The prosecution would undoubtedly argue that one child's testimony, no matter how compelling, couldn't outweigh the mountain of evidence they had presented. And there were still powerful forces that seemed determined to keep the truth about the devourers hidden. As the day's proceedings concluded, Torres met with Sarah in the conference room. This changes everything, he said, his voice filled with excitement. Zara's testimony, combined with the memory device, proves that you were telling the truth about the hostile aliens. It's a start, Sarah replied cautiously. But we still don't know who classified the mission reports or why they want to suppress the truth about the Devourers. What do you mean? Sarah looked out the conference room window at the darkening sky. Think about it, Lieutenant Commander. The Devourers exist. They're still out there, probably targeting other colonies. Yet someone has gone to great lengths to conceal their existence, even to the point of allowing me to be prosecuted as a war criminal. Torres paled as the implications sank in. You think there's a conspiracy? I think there are people in positions of power who believe that admitting the existence of the Devourers would cause more harm than covering up their attacks. They'd rather sacrifice a few human careers than acknowledge that the galaxy isn't as safe as everyone believes. That's treason. That's politics, Sarah corrected grimly. And tomorrow, when this trial resumes, we're going to find out just how far they're willing to go to protect their version of the truth. As night fell over the galactic capital, Sarah prepared for what might be the final day of her trial. Zara's courage had given her hope, but she knew that hope alone wouldn't be enough to overcome the forces arrayed against her. The truth was finally emerging, but powerful interests still had the ability to suppress it. The question was whether justice would prevail or whether the galaxy's need for comfortable lies would triumph over one small girl's inconvenient truth. The fourth day of the trial began with an unprecedented security presence in the tribunal chamber. Armed guards from multiple species stood at attention around the perimeter, while scanning devices swept the gallery for unauthorized recording equipment. The overnight analysis of Zara's memory device had sent shockwaves through the galactic intelligence community, and powerful forces were scrambling to control the narrative. Sarah noticed immediately that several faces were missing from the gallery. Some of the alien dignitaries who had attended previous sessions were conspicuously absent, replaced by stern-looking individuals whose formal attire couldn't quite conceal their military bearing. High Magistrate Veltar called the session to order with obvious reluctance. Before we proceed with closing arguments, he announced, this tribunal has received a motion from Galactic Security Command to classify all evidence presented yesterday under the Emergency Powers Act. A murmur of concern rippled through the chamber. Torres shot to his feet immediately. Your Honors, the defense objects strenuously to any attempt to classify evidence after it has been presented in open court. Such an action would constitute a fundamental violation of judicial independence. Prosecutor General Zixtaros stood as well, but her response was surprising. Your Honors, the prosecution also objects to this motion. While we understand the security concerns raised by yesterday's revelations, the integrity of this tribunal must be maintained. Judge Crickshaw leaned forward, her insectoid features unreadable. The motion is denied. This tribunal will not be subject to external pressure, regardless of the source. The evidence presented yesterday will remain part of the public record. Sarah felt a surge of relief, but she could see the tension in the faces of the military personnel scattered throughout the gallery. Someone very powerful was unhappy with the direction the trial had taken. Torres rose to present his closing argument, and Sarah could see the confidence that had been building since Zara's testimony. Honored judges, members of the galactic community, he began. For days ago, this tribunal heard accusations that painted Commander Sarachun as a war criminal who callously destroyed innocent lives. Today, we know the truth. He activated holographic displays showing the evidence that had emerged during the trial. Not just Zara's memories, but technical analyses of the alien device, sensor readings from Sarah's ship, and testimony from character witnesses who had known her for decades. The prosecution asked you to believe that a decorated officer with 30 years of unblemished service suddenly decided to commit genocide against civilians. They presented a narrative that required you to ignore Commander Chen's proven commitment to protecting innocent life, her tactical brilliance, and her unwavering moral compass. Torres paused, looking directly at each judge in turn. But yesterday, a brave child showed us what really happened on Kepler 442b. Not a massacre committed by human forces, but a rescue operation that saved the last survivors of an alien attack so horrific that our languages lack words to describe it. The young defender's voice grew stronger as he continued. The Devourers, for that is what these creatures called themselves, had already murdered 800 of the colony's inhabitants by the time Commander Chen arrived. They were in the process of torturing the survivors to death when she made the hardest decision any military commander can face. Sarah watched the judges as Torres described the impossible choice she had faced. Allow the remaining colonists to be slowly murdered by creatures that fed on their suffering, or destroy the Devourer installations knowing that some innocents would die in the bombardment. Commander Chen chose to save as many lives as possible, Torres concluded. 47 children survived because of her courage. 47 young beings who would have died horribly if she had followed conventional military doctrine and called for reinforcements that would have arrived too late. When Torres finished, the chamber fell silent. Sarah could see that his words had made an impact, but she also knew that the prosecution would have a response. Prosecutor General Zixtara rose for her closing argument with visible reluctance. Her silver features seemed dimmed, as if the revelations of the previous day had drained some vital energy from her. Honored judges, she began, the defense has presented compelling testimony about unknown alien aggressors. If true, this information certainly provides context for the defendant's actions. Sarah was surprised by the prosecutor's measured tone. She had expected a vigorous attack on the defense case, not this almost apologetic response. However, Zixtara continued, we cannot ignore the fact that 800 innocent beings died under the defendant's bombardment. Regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the alleged threat, the loss of life was catastrophic. The prosecutor's argument felt perfunctory, as if she were going through the motions rather than genuinely arguing for conviction. Sarah began to suspect that the prosecutor had received instructions to minimize the damage from this trial rather than win at all costs. The question before this tribunal is not whether Commander Chen acted with good intentions, Zixtara said. The question is whether the galactic community can accept military actions that result in such massive civilian casualties, regardless of the justification offered. When the prosecutor concluded her argument, High Magistrate Veltar announced a recess for judicial deliberation. As the judges filed out, Sarah noticed several of the military personnel in the gallery speaking urgently into communication devices. Torres met with Sarah during the recess, his expression cautiously optimistic. I think we have a real chance, he said. The prosecutor's closing was practically a concession speech, and the judges seemed genuinely affected by Zara's testimony. Don't get your hopes up too quickly, Sarah warned. There are forces at work here that go beyond this courtroom. Even if the tribunal finds me innocent, there are people who want this whole matter buried. What do you mean? Before Sarah could answer, a commotion erupted outside the conference room. Through the windows, they could see emergency vehicles converging on the courthouse, their lights flashing in the artificial twilight of the galactic capital. A court bailiff burst into the room, his face pale with shock. Commander Chun, Lieutenant Commander Torres, you need to see this immediately. They followed the bailiff to a secure communications room, where a large display screen showed breaking news from across the galaxy. The headline scrolled in multiple languages, Alien Attack on Outer Rim Colony. Unknown aggressors using harvesting technology. Sarah's blood ran cold as she watched footage from the planet Zirian 7. The images were hauntingly familiar. Biomechanical devices attached to screaming victims, shadow creatures moving through devastated settlements, and the distinctive energy signatures that she had learned to associate with Devourer technology. It's happening again, she whispered. The news report continued with expert analysis and government statements. Military commanders across the galaxy were scrambling to respond to the attack, but their conventional weapons were proving ineffective against enemies that existed partially outside normal space. This changes everything, Torres said, his voice tight with tension. The public knows about the Devourers now. They can't suppress this information anymore. But Sarah's attention was focused on something else in the news feed. a brief image of Galactic Command's emergency response meeting. In the background, she could see familiar faces from the prosecution team, along with high-ranking military officials who had been conspicuously absent from the trial. "They knew," she said quietly. "They've known about the Devourers all along, and they've been planning how to deal with them. Then why prosecute you? Why not just admit that you were fighting an unknown enemy?" Sarah turned away from the screen, her expression grim. Because admitting that would mean acknowledging that the galaxy isn't safe, that their entire security apparatus failed to detect a threat that had been operating for months. It was easier to blame a human commander for excessive force than to admit institutional failure. The Bayless communication device chirped urgently. "The judges are ready to reconvene," he announced. "They've reached a verdict." The walk back to the courtroom felt surreal. Outside, news broadcasts continued to report on the attack at Zirian 7. While inside the courthouse, Sarah's fate was about to be decided based on events that had occurred 3 years earlier on a different world. The tribunal chamber was packed when they returned. Word of the new Devourer attack had spread quickly, and media representatives from across the galaxy crowded the press section. In the front row of the gallery, young Zara sat with the other Nexarian survivors, her small hand clutching the memory device that had changed everything. High Magistrate Veltar called for order as the judges took their places. His expression was grave as he prepared to read the verdict. "This tribunal has deliberated extensively on the charges against Commander Sarah Chun," he began. "The case has raised fundamental questions about military conduct, civilian protection, and the nature of threats facing our galactic community." Sarah stood at attention, her hands clasped behind her back, as the magistrate continued. "The evidence presented has shown that the defendant faced an unprecedented situation on Kepler 442b. The testimony of witness Zaraneth Ka, corroborated by alien technology beyond our current understanding, has demonstrated that the defendant's actions were taken in response to a genuine threat to civilian lives." A murmur of anticipation ran through the chamber. However, the magistrate continued, "This tribunal cannot ignore the massive loss of life that resulted from the defendant's decision. 800 beings died under bombardment ordered by Commander Chun, regardless of the circumstances that prompted that decision." Sarah's heart sank. Even with Zara's testimony and the evidence of the Devourers, the judges were still focused on the casualty count. After careful consideration, High Magistrate Veltar said, "This tribunal finds Commander Sarah Chun." He paused, looking directly at Sarah before continuing, "Not guilty of war crimes against civilian populations." The chamber erupted in chaos. Some beings cheered, others shouted in protest, and media representatives scrambled to transmit the verdict across the galaxy. But the magistrate wasn't finished. He struck his gavel repeatedly until order was restored. "While the tribunal finds the defendant not guilty of the primary charges," he continued, "we also find that her actions, though justified under the extreme circumstances, resulted in consequences that cannot be ignored. Therefore, this tribunal issues the following recommendations to Galactic Command and the Terran Space Forces." Sarah listened as the magistrate outlined a series of recommendations for new protocols regarding unknown threats, improved rules of engagement for protecting civilian populations, and the establishment of a joint task force to investigate and counter the Devourer threat. Furthermore, the magistrate concluded, this tribunal recommends that Commander Sarah Chun be assigned to lead this new task force, given her unique experience with the threat in question. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She had been tried as a war criminal for fighting the Devourers, and now she was being asked to lead the galaxy's response against them. As the formal proceedings concluded and the chamber began to empty, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers and reporters. But she only had eyes for one person, young Zara, who was making her way through the crowd with determined steps. When the little girl reached her, Sarah knelt down to meet her at eye level. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "You were very brave." Zara looked up at her with serious eyes. "Will you stop the shadow things? Will you make sure they can't hurt anyone else?" Sarah thought about the attack on Azirian 7, about the colonies that might already be under assault, about the families that could be suffering the same fate as Zara's parents. "I'll do everything I can," she promised. Zara smiled for the first time since Sarah had known her, then pressed the memory device into Sarah's hands. "You'll need this," she said, "to help you remember why it matters." As the courthouse emptied and the galactic capital returned to its normal rhythm, Sarah stood in the marble hallway, holding the alien device that had saved her career and possibly her life. The weight of new responsibility settled on her shoulders, not just leading a task force against an unknown enemy, but carrying the hopes of every being who had suffered at the hands of the Devourers. The trial was over, but Sarah knew that her real work was just beginning. Somewhere in the vast darkness of space, the creatures that fed on suffering and pain were planning their next attack. And now was her job to stop them. She looked down at the memory device in her palm, its quantum patterns shifting in the light. Inside this small object were the memories of a little girl who had witnessed horrors beyond imagination and still found the courage to speak the truth. It was a responsibility Sarah would carry for the rest of her life. 3 months later, Commander Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the U.S. Redemption 2, flagship of the newly formed Galactic Defense Task Force. Her crew was a mix of humans and aliens, all volunteers who had signed up to face an enemy that defied conventional understanding. In her ready room, mounted in a place of honor, was a small hologram of Zaraneth Ka. The girl was older now, 10 years old, and attending a new school on her homeworld. She sent regular messages to Sarah, always ending with the same words, "Thank you for remembering." The Devourers had struck 3 more colonies since the trial, but each time the task force had arrived faster, fought smarter, and saved more lives. They were learning, adapting, developing new weapons and tactics to counter an enemy that existed partially outside normal space. It was dangerous work. Sarah had already lost good people to the shadow creatures and their harvesting machines. But every life they saved, every colony they protected, justified the sacrifices. The intercom on her desk chimed softly. "Commander," came the voice of her executive officer, "we're receiving a distress signal from the Tau Ceti system." Sarah stood and walked to the bridge, where her crew was already preparing for another jump into the unknown. As they entered hyperspace, racing toward another desperate battle against an implacable enemy, she thought about the little girl whose courage had made all of this possible. Somewhere in the galaxy, beings lived in safety because a 10-year-old child had found the strength to speak the truth. And that truth had set not just Sarah free, but had given the galaxy hope in its darkest hour. The words that had silenced the courtroom, "That's the soldier who saved me," had become a rallying cry for everyone who stood against the darkness. Sarah Chun had been acquitted of war crimes, but more importantly, she had been vindicated in her belief that sometimes the hardest choices were also the right ones. The fight against the Devourers was far from over. But for the first time since that terrible day on Kepler 442b, Sarah believed that victory was possible. And in a small school on a distant world, a young girl looked up at the stars and smiled, knowing that somewhere out there, the soldier who had saved her was still fighting to keep the galaxy safe. The truth had set them both free.